All right, so welcome to part two of Boethius, the architect of the Middle Ages. In this section, we're going to take a look at books 2 and 3 of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. And in book 2, the concept of fate is introduced. And Boethius really laments how fate is turned against him. You know, he is an individual for whom everything seems to have gone well. When his father died, he was adopted into the Symmachus family. He was given all rank and privilege. He has the ability to rise through the ranks and become consul. His sons are able to rise to become consul. When he's falsely accused of these charges that are going to ultimately lead to his death, he is not horribly mistreated. He is placed under house arrest, far away from his family and friends, but still in a fairly comfortable environment. And his sons are not punished with him. They still continue to hold their position. He has good things, but he has bad things too that is going on in his life. But like many of us, Boethius is simply lamenting the bad without really considering the good. And so when he's doing this, Lady Philosophy is going to make this statement. She says, "You are wrong if you think that fortune has changed towards you. Change is her normal behavior, her true nature. In the very act of changing, she has preserved her own particular kind of constancy towards you." In other words, Boethius really thinks that fate is turned against him. Whereas he had property and position, now he's imprisoned, facing a death sentence. But as Lady Philosophy explains, fate is a blind goddess. She makes no distinction between one person and another. She just keeps turning that wheel of fate. A person can be a king one minute on top of the world, and then fall to the depths of despair the next minute, and then rise back to the top. All of this can happen very quickly. So fate's job is ultimately to just keep turning the wheel. What happens to you can happen to anybody. There's nothing personal about it. There's nothing predictable about it. It is just simply the way that things are. If you look at the image that you see on the screen there, as well as the cover of your book, you see that idea of the wheel turning, and you see the guy sitting on top looking like a king, and the wheel gets turned and somebody's on the downward spiral while somebody else is on the upward spiral. And there's somebody down there at the very pits of despair. The simple fact is that this material world is one that is constantly changing. As Heraclitus taught us, it is a world that is constantly in flux. And so with that being the case, we should not expect that fate is simply going to stop spinning the wheel, that change is going to stop occurring, because that would be contrary to its very nature. The wheel has to continue to spin. And that means that sometimes we are on the up, sometimes we are on the down. It is my belief that history is a wheel. Inconsistency is my very essence, says the wheel. Rise up on my spokes if you like, but don't complain when you're cast back down into the depths. Good times pass away, but then so do the bad. Mutability is our tragedy, but it's also our hope. The worst of time, like the best, are always passing away. In section 2 of book 2, Lady Philosophy tells Boethius that if the things that he lost were really his, then he would never have been able to lose them. And so this is actually another east-west parallel going back to the Bhagavad Gita. In the Gita, we learn that nothing in this material world actually belongs to us. Everything that exists belongs to God. But by his mercy, we're allowed to make use of certain things that we need in order to survive the material condition. But we shouldn't complain when the things that we've borrowed are taken back by their rightful owner. So anything in this material world, anything of the material condition can be lost, which means that that was never really his to begin with. But anything spiritual, anything that's attached to the soul, can never be taken away, because it really is what belongs to you. Ultimately, Boethius's view is very much like this. He's trying to help us to understand that we get so caught up in the material condition. We get so caught up in this notion that, I want to hold on to what I possess. I want to make more of these things. But this drive is not a liberating factor. It is, in essence, almost a punishing factor, because it traps us to this condition. It traps us to this world. God is going to grant individuals that opportunity to be able to have what is actually needed. It is on loan to us. But anything that belongs to the material world is already temporary and transient. So why should we lament when those things are taken back? What is really ours, what is part of the eternal, can never be stolen away. So there's really no reason for him to lament or complain about what's happened to him. This is simply, again, that wheel of fate turning and twisting. Mutability is our tragedy, but it's also our hope. The worst of time, like the best, are always passing away. In section 3 of Book 2, Lady Philosophy gets Boethius to look at all of the blessings that he's had throughout his life. When his father died, instead of becoming a ward of the state, he was adopted into the powerful Symmachus family. He held a good position throughout most of his life, and his sons became consuls. When he was convicted, the sons that could have suffered along with him as well did not. They maintained their position. They maintained the family home and property. He complains about this place of exile, but she reminds him that he's living in someone's home rather than a dungeon. He has every liberty except liberty. And the home that he's staying in, it may be smaller than what he's accustomed to, but it's still larger than what most of the people of Rome enjoy. So rather than looking to his losses, he needs to look to his blessings. Consider his blessings. This is one of the problems of the human condition. We always notice the negative, very rarely the positive. A person that's brought up struggling for survival may notice when a kindness is done to them, because it's unusual. But a person who's born to rank and privilege tends to expect and feel entitled. A person can have all of the privileges that life can offer, but not even notice them. They just take them for granted. But as soon as something bad happens, they're going to moan and complain about it without stop. And this is what Boethius is doing here. It's what most people do. And so Lady Philosophy is saying to him, look to the positive. Take pleasure in what it is that life gives to you. The human condition that we live under is always subject to the wheel of fate, which means that there's always going to be highs, there's always going to be lows. The key is to rise above them. Like a Vaishnav of India, we should strive to not be affected by the highs and the lows of all things. We should not worry about these issues. We should not allow ourselves to be afflicted by them. We need to not pay attention to that changing wheel of fate. Don't look to the material things for our happiness or our pleasure. We need to find what we're looking for somewhere else. So don't allow yourself to be afflicted by these highs and lows. Don't look to the material things for happiness, because that's not where you're going to find it. Genuine happiness is something that can only be found by surrendering to the absolute, by surrendering to God. That's where truth is going to be found. And ultimately, nowhere else is that going to happen. This passage from section 7 really brings all of this home for us. But it is great men we are considering, men who seek fame for virtue. What do they care about reputation when the body grows lifeless in death, which ends all things? If the whole of man dies, body and soul, a belief which our reason forbids us, fame is nothing at all, since the man who is said to have won it doesn't exist. But if the mind stays conscious when it is freed from the earthly prison and seeks out heaven in freedom, surely it will despise every earthly affair. In the experience of heaven, it will rejoice in delivery from earthly things. And so, ultimately, again, we should not look to the material world for our pleasure or our happiness. Entertainment, wealth, power, these things are temporary and illusory. The only thing that matters is what is eternal. Like Plato seeking the absolute truth, coming to understand the higher reality of all things. And when one comes to this higher realization that the material does not matter, that the eternal is what is real, then you are freed from this earthly prison, as he says here. You will despise every earthly affair. The things that we long for now, the things that we strive for in this world, will not have any meaning for us. They will not be sweet anymore. We will despise them because we know that they are things that are imprisonments. They're trapping us in the world that we are living in. In section 8, he says, bad fortune is more use to a man than good fortune. Good fortune always seems to bring happiness, but deceives you with her smiles, whereas bad fortune is always truthful, because by change she shows her true fickleness. Ultimately, we learn more from bad fortune than we do from good, because again, when things are going our way, we just accept it and take it for granted. But when things go wrong, we complain about it, we become upset by it, but we also can learn from it if we're intelligent enough to do so. And so when something happens that we don't like, when something bad happens, the intelligent person is going to take that, bring it into their knowledge base, and use it in a way that's going to make things better in the long run. And this is an issue that will come up later on in Book 5. As we move into Book 3, the first several sections of Book 3 reinforce the same basic idea. We should steer away from the material things of this world and seek out our true constitutional position. We know that individuals are constantly striving in this world for more and more of the material. People want wealth. They want money, because with money they can do so many things, they believe. With money they can buy themselves happiness. High office becomes an important thing. A person wants a position of power, because then they can control and manipulate things to their will. And people desire fame. They want their 15 minutes in the spotlight. Every individual wants more and more fame. The thing is that while these things are not necessarily bad or evil, a person who has wealth, position, or fame can in fact use those things in a benevolent way to help and benefit others. But many times we don't. The more we become attached to these material things, there's essentially two things that are going to happen. One, as we become more attached to them, we are going to strive for more and more and more. It's really quite insatiable, this lust for these things. The more we have, the more we want. No politician has ever said that, well, I want to be a one-term alderman and then retire. You get on that platform and you want to go to the next step, and the next one, and the next one. But of course we end up getting stymied because only so many people can become governor. Only so many people can become president. there's limited resources that get in the way of our drive and our desire. And the same thing with wealth. Individuals want more and more and more, no matter how much they have. You can have people that have more money than anybody could possibly ever use, but that doesn't stop them from desiring to make more. And fame, well, again, everyone has that desire for the spotlight for a little while, but once you get hold of that bug, you've got to keep it going and keep it going, and people will do the most ridiculous things to keep that fame moving forward. And so people seek this power in these material things, and it traps them in that way to make them desire more and more, which pulls them further into this material condition. But it does something else too. It also, instead of liberating us, which we think these things are going to do, it further entraps us. When a person has tremendous wealth or fame or power, that person can't just randomly decide to go off and do something like they want to. Everything has to be planned and plotted. You are constantly worrying. If you have money, you're worrying that it's going to be taken from you, that it's going to be stolen. When you are in the public spotlight, you're worrying about your reputation, and you're worrying about whether there are people out there that may want to assassinate you too. And so you are very much looking over your shoulder your entire life, and so you're trapped in a way. So rather than bringing any real long-term pleasure or happiness, these things overall bring us misery. There may be temporary happiness we can get from it, but happiness is never a long-lasting thing in this material world. It's there for a moment and then it's gone. It's fleeting. And so most of our existence is spent seeking happiness, or noticing that what we once had is now gone and trying to find it again. And so we end up with this sense of misery all the time. So seeking wealth, high office, fame, all of those things, they will ultimately bring a lot more suffering than they do pleasure. And so we need to stop worrying about those so much. That is false happiness. We need to see what real happiness is. We need to understand the concept of true happiness. So as we move to Book 3, Section 9, Lady Philosophy declares that what causes unhappiness is seeking the part rather than the whole. As you may recall, when Lady Philosophy is first introduced, the text speaks about her dress. The dress represents knowledge. And we talked about how the marauders ripped away pieces from the dress, and then they claimed to have taken all of it. But this is foolish. I mean, if we analyze one single drop of water, that doesn't mean that we understand everything there is to know about the ocean. We can't scientifically evaluate the city of Rome and know everything that there is to know about the universe. For real happiness, we need absolute knowledge. And for Boethius, absolute knowledge equates to God. So seeking the part rather than the whole is the cause of unhappiness. It is, going back to Plato and Socrates, this idea that these people are not like Socrates. They don't recognize their own limitations. They don't seek to try to discover the absolute truth. They take hold of what little bit of truth they happen to get hold of, and they run with it, believing that they know more and more and more things all the time. And so Lady Philosophy asks Boethius, what do you think we ought to do now in order to be worthy of the discovering of the source of supreme good? If I want genuine good, if I want genuine happiness. And Boethius's response, we ought to pray to the Father of all things. And so ultimately, we want to recognize, first of all, that there is an equation of happiness with possessing the absolute truth, existing in the eternal rather than the temporal. and the absolute truth itself is equivalent to God. So by praying to God, we can come to know him directly and embrace that understanding. So we have to prove the existence of God. If happiness equals absolute truth, which equals God, then we have to come to know God. But Boethius, remember, is very modern in his approach to philosophy. He doesn't want to rely upon revelation. He doesn't want to claim that just because it says something in a particular book or was mentioned by a church father, that that's automatically the truth. He says we have to prove the truth. If you want me to believe it, I have to see the evidence. And so he wants a logical explanation. He wants us to properly comprehend what this entails. Can I prove the existence of God? And so in sections 10 and 12 of chapter 3, Boethius is going to foreshadow two of the major proofs for the existence of God, the ontological proof and the cosmological proof. These are made famous later by Anselm in the 12th century and by Aquinas in the 13th century. So Boethius is not really laying out the exact arguments that later become so famous in philosophy, but he is actually giving us sort of foreshadowing it. He's laying the foundation for these. And so we need to look just a little bit at those theories. We'll start with the ontological proof. So the proof, the ontological proof, ontology is the study of being. So the ontological proof for the existence of God looks to the core essence of God. What God is becomes the means of proving God's existence. Now, this proof was made famous by Anselm in the 12th century. Anselm is one of the great thinkers and great figures of what's known as the philosophical Renaissance. Most of the time in history, we think about the Renaissance as happening around the 14th, 15th century, but in philosophy, the 12th century is really perceived as being the founding point of the Renaissance, because it's when logic starts to come into play. So Anselm, who eventually will actually in 1093 rise to be Archbishop of Canterbury, holds a very prominent place, very prominent position within the church. He will eventually become Saint Anselm because of his writings and because of his works there. But anyway, in a work called the Proslogion, he is going to give us this cosmological, or this ontological proof, rather, of the existence of God. He says that what we have to do is to look at the core essence of God. So by definition, what is God? And he says, well, God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. There is nothing that we can imagine or contemplate which is greater or superior to God. I can't imagine that there is anything in existence that is beyond God. He is the absolute of all things. Now, once I have that definition in place, then that means that if I start listing all of the different attributes of God, God is all-powerful, God is all-loving, God is all-knowing, and so on, I have to include existence as one of those attributes. Because if I didn't, I could imagine something that's greater, because clearly it is greater to have an entity that's described like this that is real, as opposed to one that's merely an illusion, merely a fantasy. And so every time we utter the word God, we are implying that which exists. Now, of course, this proof has a great flaw in that it largely begs the question. In logic, there are a number of different fallacies. There's one called begging the question. In a begging the question fallacy, you are presupposing to be true the very thing that you're supposed to be trying to prove. And so Anselm is basically saying, well, if I start by assuming that God exists, then it follows that God exists. To Anselm, this is not a problem, because as we saw before, he has this concept, credo ut intelligentem, I believe in order to understand. Logic, reason, human understanding is great, but it should be used simply to back up our religious beliefs. And so Anselm already accepts, he already believes in the existence of God anyway. So if that's the case, then if Anselm already believes in the existence of God, then all he needs is something to back it up. And he argues that this logic is something that can, in fact, be able to do that. It does have that capacity to be able to do so. There was a monk in his order called Gunillo, who will point out very shortly after he writes this, the basic flaw is that this argument is not going to convince anybody who doesn't already believe in the existence of God. Because if you are trying to use this argument to convince an atheist that God exists, and you say to that atheist, what is God? Define him for me. An atheist isn't going to say God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. What he's going to say is something like, well, God is a mythical being that was created to control and manipulate the masses. And if you use that definition, then this whole ontological proof falls apart. And this is the flaw, this is the problem with this particular argument, is that you have to accept this particular definition before you can reach the conclusion that Anselm wants us to reach. So the ontological proof, while it is applauded by many people, is actually a very weak proof. Boethius, in Book 3, Section 10, is not going to give us the specific ontological proof, but he is going to give us the basic definition, the basic wording that's used here. But his argument is actually a little bit stronger than the later, more famous one that Anselm gives. He says, as to where it is to be found, then, you should think as follows. It is the universal understanding of the human mind that God, the author of all things, is good, since nothing can be conceived better than God. Everyone agrees that that which has no superior is good. Reason shows that God is so good that we are convinced that his goodness is perfect. Otherwise, he couldn't be the author of creation. There would have to be something else possessing perfect goodness over and above God, which would seem to be superior to him and of greater antiquity. For all perfect things are obviously superior to those that are imperfect. Therefore, to avoid an unending argument, it must be admitted that the supreme God is to the highest degree filled with supreme and perfect goodness. But we have agreed that perfect good is true happiness, so that it follows that true happiness is to be found in the supreme God. So you'll notice that the basic definition that Anselm is going to use comes straight from Boethius here. Nothing can be conceived better than God, right? God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. But yet, in Boethius's argument, he draws that link, he draws that connection between the idea of God as that perfect eternal entity and that sense of true goodness or true happiness that we ultimately can find. And so in a rather Platonic move, thinking of realms of being and realms of becoming again, if we are going to experience even this temporary finite sense of happiness that exists in this world, there has to be a perfect ultimate form that it is emulating. There has to be something that is there that is in conjunction with it. And so if God did not exist, because there is no realm of being per se, there is God. If God didn't exist, there would be nothing for that perfect goodness, there would be nothing for that perfect happiness to exist within. And so God becomes necessary for that reason, so that there is that perfect form that exists within the mind, within the heart of God, that the things of this world are trying to emulate. And so I think that his argument is a little bit, I mean, all arguments to prove the existence of God are ultimately flawed, but it's better, shall we say, than the one that Anselm ultimately gives us. The other great proof for the existence of God is called the cosmological proof. And this was given to us by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Thomas Aquinas is probably the biggest figure in medieval philosophy, Christian philosophy. Much of his work, much of his teachings goes on to help formulate basic Catholic beliefs. But anyway, in his work, the Summa Theologica, he is going to give us what becomes known as the cosmological proof for the existence of God. He basically disagrees with Anselm. He says that we can't look to the core essence of God to come to know God's existence because we don't have direct access to it. The existence of God is not self-evident. So if we want to know whether God exists or not, we have to look to the incorporeal through the corporeal. In other words, we have to look at what we don't have direct access to by looking first at what we do have access to. Just like Plato in the Symposium is going to argue that by looking at the poor copies of things in this world, we can ultimately become linked to that reality or that higher truth of that other realm. Thomas Aquinas is going to argue that, in actuality, if we look at the effects of God, we can derive the existence of God from there. If we look at the things of this world, we can come to understand his view. So what Aquinas is going to do is to produce an argument that's known as the 5 proofs or the 5 ways. These are the argument from motion, the argument from efficient cause, the argument from possibility and necessity, the argument from the gradation to be found in things, and the argument from final cause. Now, the 4th of these, the argument from the gradation to be found in things, is largely grounded in Plato's philosophy, and it's very similar to the argument that we just looked at from Boethius. The idea that there has to be an ultimate or a perfect form of something that these lower forms are trying to emulate. And so he uses fire or heat as an example. But we could use any number of things. I think that benevolence is a good example. We recognize that there are instances of people acting benevolently within this world. But how do we know that? Well, we only know that because there is the perfect form of benevolence that exists. And if that perfect form didn't exist, there'd be nothing for that lower form to emulate. In addition, we wouldn't be able to judge how close or how far away we were from it. If I wanted to measure how benevolent a particular person in this world was, I would need that ultimate example so that I would be able to say, how close or how far away I was from that other person. And so again, because we're not imagining multiple realms anymore, we have to have that form dwelling somewhere. And for Aquinas, the only place that could exist would be God. and so God must exist for that reason. The other four arguments are all derived from variations on Aristotle's theory of the forms. Aristotle, as you recall, told us that we have the prime mover, who is pure actuality, and that prime mover sits there in perfect contemplation of itself, but it causes the movers to want to push the form onto the prime matter, the building block of existence, the pure potential, to create a physical thing that exists in this world. And then, of course, within that physical thing is the desire to maximize its potential, which it then becomes actualized. And so I showed you that the acorn would become an oak tree, which could then produce more acorns, that could produce more oak trees, and so on and so forth. And ultimately it was that desire to be like the prime mover, to join in that perfection, that eternal absolute state, that was pulling and driving all of these things forward. And so the argument from motion basically says that the only reason why there is movement or motion is because the things of this world lack perfection. There is the desire to keep moving forward to try to attain it. And if there was not the example of perfection, then there would be nothing pulling it or driving it towards trying to achieve that perfection. So the very fact that we can look at this world and see motion taking place, movement, change, flux, implies that there must be something there that is that perfect ideal that we're striving towards. And to the 13th century mind, nothing else could be that other than God. The argument from efficient cause. Remember the four causes of Aristotle: formal, final, material, and efficient. The efficient cause is that which brings a thing into existence, what brings it into being. And so if we trace back, we know that the oak tree exists. Well, why does the oak tree exist? Because of the acorn that it grew from. Why does that acorn exist? Because of the oak tree that it fell from, and so on, back and back. But this cannot go on in an infinite regression forever. There has to be a first point. And ultimately, that first point is the prime mover. For Aquinas, the prime mover is God. And so God is that only being that is completely and utterly eternal, that has always been there and always will be, that thing from which everything else can sprout. And so if God didn't exist, there would be no first cause, and nothing else would exist. The argument from final cause just simply takes the argument the other direction. It's the fact that everything is being pulled towards something. It's the argument from motion, the argument from final cause, really very, very closely linked, very, very similar. But the argument from motion is just talking about the actual fact that there is motion or movement in the world, that there's this forward-reaching belief. Whereas the argument from final cause is saying that everything is trying to attain, is trying to achieve this ultimate goal of perfection. And so there has to be some perfect thing that it's striving towards, again, God. The third argument, the argument from possibility and necessity, I've always considered it to be the best of the five. Aquinas basically says here that there are two types of things: those that are absolutely necessary, and those that are merely a matter of potentiality or possibility. The problem is that when we look around the world, everything that we see is simply a matter of possibility. Everything is contingent. The building that you're in exists because somebody chose to build it on that spot. But they could very easily have chosen to build it somewhere else or not at all. You yourself exist because your parents decided to come together at the right moment to produce you. And that's something that very easily could have not happened. And so we look around the world and we see a lot of possibility, but we don't see anything that is absolutely necessary. But the thing is, nothing springs out of nothing. Everything comes from something, right? Granted, there's a few Buddhists that would give you an argument on that, but from the Western perspective, nothing is going to come out of nothing. It always comes out of something. Even when you look back to the creation of the universe in Genesis, we talk about creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothingness, but it's not nothingness because God was there. God was an eternal entity that already existed that could bring everything else into being. If God did not exist as that eternal entity, then nothing would exist. We would not be here having this conversation right now. Aquinas wouldn't have been there writing these stories. Boethius would not have been facing those problems. The universe would not exist without God, because there has to have been something that is eternal and absolute that everything can spring from. And I like this argument because while it doesn't necessarily prove that God must exist, although again, to a 13th century mind, that would be the only explanation, it doesn't necessarily prove God would exist, but it does prove that there has to be something that exists. There has to be something that is an eternal entity, something that has always been there and always will be. And maybe it's nothing more than background radiation that scientists sometimes talk about. But there has to have been something that's always there that will become the building blocks of everything. And so these are the 5 arguments, the 5 proofs. And in each one of those, as hopefully you were able to see, what Thomas Aquinas is really doing is to say, look, I can't know God directly, so let us look back at what the universe is. Let's look at its motion. Let's look at its change. Let's look at all these different factors of what we can see, and then logically extrapolate from that the existence of what we cannot see. And so Boethius, again, is not going to give us this specific argument, but the foundation for it is found here in section 12 of Book 3. The world would never have coalesced into one form out of such diverse and antagonistic parts, had there not been one who could unify such diversity. Their very diversity in turn would make them break out in dissension and tear apart and destroy the unity of the world unless there were a power capable of holding together what he had once woven. Nature's fixed order could not proceed on its path, and the various kinds of change could not exhibit motions so orderly in place, time, effect, distance from one another, and nature, unless there was one unmoving and stable power to regulate them. For this power, whatever it is, through which creation remains in existence and in motion, I use the word which all people use, namely God. And so, again, while he doesn't break down into these specific types of arguments, we see the basic idea that if we want to know God, we have to look at the corporeal world. We have to look at what is around us. We recognize, for example, that this earth exists in just the right spot, that it's not too close to the sun to be too hot for life. It's not too far away from the sun to be too cold for life. There is enough fresh water to exist and to not burn away because of the heat, to not freeze up because of the cold. The oxygen atmosphere, all of this stuff exists. And it's pretty remarkable that it exists right here on this one planet in such a way that life can form and exist. And so how could that be unless there was a plan, unless there was a design behind it? And so we see that not only are we getting to the idea of the cosmological argument, but also a much later argument called the design argument too, that the universe itself could not exist the way it does unless there was a designer to create it that way. So through these arguments, Boethius basically proves, at least to himself, that God exists and that God rules the universe by the helm of goodness. He also indicates that this proof was made with one internal proof grafted upon another, so that each drew its credibility from that which preceded. As he promised, he's not going to just accept something based upon revelation or because it says it in a book. He wants logical proof. And so whether we agree with the arguments that he presented or not, we can appreciate the fact that he is trying to put this on a scientific level. He is trying to give justification and proof as to why it is we should believe, why it is that we should accept. So we see Boethius influencing thinkers beyond the Middle Ages. During the medieval period, thinkers relied very heavily on divine revelation. But Boethius served this basic motto of logic, not revelation. Logic demands facts and proof. Anselm, the more famous author of the ontological proof, said, "Credo ut intelligentem," I believe in order to understand. But by contrast, Boethius's approach was intelligento ad credam, I understand in order to believe. Anselm and the others like him, they looked to logic as a way of backing up what was already believed. But Boethius, in this more modern sense, wanted logic to prove the point before he would believe it. And this may be the very reason why Boethius becomes such a prominent and such an influential figure. He is an individual who is foreshadowing this scientific, logical approach that modern philosophy is going to demand. His view is more rigorous than what has come before it and much of what has come after it through the medieval period. But in this way, he says, look, we now have evidence, we now have proof that God exists. And now that we have that proof, we can understand that real happiness is going to equate to absolute truth. And absolute truth equates to God. All right, well, we will pick this up in the next video when we take a look at books 4 and 5 of the Consolation.